when our paths cross today with one of the leading psychologists, like I had said before the show, tiptoeing in neuroscience to bring some truth and light to what is going on inside of our brains. Ethan Kross is here joining us today on Turtlecast to talk about the voice inside of our head and how he has coined it with his best-selling book here, phenomenally well-written, called Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It. And just to kick that off, Ethan, before you say anything, first of all, you said the voice in our head, why it matters, and how to harness it. So you talk about the thing, whether it be a problem, you talk about its importance, and then you also talk about how to use it. So the book is essentially a massive solution to my own brain.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that is how you have received it, because that was the goal. The goal was to really shine a spotlight on what I think is, on the one hand, an incredibly familiar and intimate experience that we all have, which is having this ability to silently use language, right? To think about our lives, but we don't quite understand how that works. And sometimes it gets us into trouble. And when it does, science provides some tools for helping people manage it. And so sounds like some of those tools resonated, which I'd love to hear more about.
Well, yeah. So first of all, you use the word tool, which is duh. The great part about a tool here, tool's kind of agnostic. It sits around. Like, you can put it in your garage, hanging on the shelf, keep it in your back pocket, keep it in your mind. But the question is, do you want to pick it up and use it for good, or use it for bad, or just ignore it altogether? And I think the appreciation of free will for the use of this tool is fundamentally important here. And you give enough credibility to why that tool should be used for your benefit through the stories that you offer here in the book. But to kick this off, I got to say that I've had many moments in my own life where I've had some internal chatter. I don't know if it's my default state, but I'm like, oh, this is a good idea. And it is a horrifically bad idea. But I found that the earlier stages of my life with my own chatter, my self-awareness was albeit limited. And through that limited self-awareness, I ignored sort of my intuitive gut. You know, like the chatter, I've almost like selling myself on a bad idea. I know it's bad, but I continue to reframe it into something good because of my ego, or emotion steps in, or something of a what do I say is like a recycled negative thought that kind of overrides the logic that should be sitting there within my thought process altogether. And it would have been interesting to understand in my own mind, whether it be MRI scans to see what's lighting up. What is the perception here of my own reality that has led to me making this specific choice? And a foundational part of your book that I think you stood off of is the fact that emotion or thoughts in the mind are received as pain in exactly the same way as physical pain is received. It's lighting up those same centers within your head. So that then begged the question for me: if I am having a thought or reinforcing things that are negative, I'm actually inflicting harm upon the self. And when I'm constantly living in a state of harm or like a state of fear, that doesn't afford me to make foundationally good choices for myself or for others. Would you concur on something like that?
Yeah, and I would add one important distinction that I think we should draw listeners' attention to, which is the fact that you very nicely said, if I continue to be in that state of harm over time, I think you use words to that effect.
Yes.
But I want to draw a distinction between experiencing pain and chronic pain, because I think there's a really important difference there. And it's a point I make in the book. A lot of people think, and I know this because I've spoken to countless people since this book came out and before it, a lot of people strive to rid themselves of all negative emotions, of all pain in their lives. And I actually don't think that is a healthy goal to have. Number one, good luck trying to do that.
Right.
It's pretty hard to rid yourself of all negativity. But I think it's important to remind people that negative emotions in small doses are elegantly adaptive. They serve us well. This is true of negative emotions. It's true of pain as well. Like pain is an incredibly useful response precisely because it feels bad.
Mm.
So let me give you an example. I love cooking, and on occasion I'm hot dogging it in the kitchen, trying to show off to my daughters. I'm flipping things, and
Oh yeah.
maybe like I get a little bit too close to the stove, and the fire brushes up against my hand, and what do? I scream. I don't like pain. I don't like it, but I recognize its value. Like it
Yes.
hurts, and I pull my hand away. If I couldn't experience pain, what would happen? I would leave my hand in that flame, my tissue would burn, and I would become really ill. There are kids who are sadly born each year with the inability to experience pain due to a genetic polymorphism.
Right.
They end up dying young because they don't have those cues to say, hey, pull your hand away from the stove or stop scratching the mosquito bite, because it's getting infected. So, anxiety, depression, anger, these negative states, we don't need to rid ourselves of them. Small doses, they help us. When they become incredibly toxic and interfere with your success,
Right.
your health, your relationships, is when we experience those states and they become chronic because we keep on revving them up in our heads, which is what chatter is all about.
You know, that's actually it's quite fantastic. And when I think about pain, I look at pain as a catalyst for learning. You I'm just saying in general, in your life
Mhm.
can have the perception that pain is this negative thing that is actually holding you back. But if you don't learn from an error that has occurred and take the time to reflect on it, like you say your brain's like a time machine, well then you can't you're going to continually repeat that same process. And I don't know how many times you show off in front of your kids. Probably a bunch. I would do it too if I was a father. I'd continue to burn myself. But
You don't realize that these kids are very hard to impress. So
I can imagine you're going to
very
have to light your
very
whole
hard to
self on
impress.
fire next. I mean, I
That's
think
right.
that's going to be
That's
the big
right.
thing.
And then like come back from ashes. That might do it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. Ethan Kross, Rise of the Phoenix. That's going to be
That's
his
right.
next novel.
That's right.
But when I look at that and we talk about these negative aspects within our mind that we think about, if I am having this sort of burn that happens physical or burn that happens within my mind, you have to afford it some sort of focus. You have to integrate with that other catalyst, that negatively perceived one, so that you can understand it and then evolve with it, right? It's not to eradicate it from your life, but actually bring it into your foundation of understanding so that you become more well-rounded. And when these catalysts continue to occur, they don't shake you as much as they typically would. And
That
that
that's
builds up sort of that will and strength within the mind, right?
That's exactly right, and that's in fact where chatter often ignites. Many people, when they experience adversity, whether it be physical or emotional pain, anxiety, anger, sadness, they reflexively turn their attention inward to make sense of the experience, to learn from it, to figure out why this happened, usually to prevent it from happening again. The problem is that when they engage in this very well intentioned response of trying to sort something out, they end up getting stuck. And
Mm.
they get stuck in these negative thought loops where they're not making progress towards figuring a solution out. Instead, it's just turning the negative experience over and over and over again in their head. And that's what can be really debilitating. And I talk about a ton of different tools in the book for managing chatter, harnessing this voice to make it work for you rather than against you. All of those tools focus on helping people get unstuck,
Mm.
not so that they can just be in the moment and not thinking about the past or the present, but rather helping people get unstuck so that they can make sense of their experiences in the world more productively in ways that do allow them to move on and get closure and learn and grow.
Yeah, I want to ask this because I think this is really interesting. A lot of the self-help, and you can read these, all these different books, and you've heard the proverbial "don't think of a white bear," and then instantly we think of a white
I
bear.
just thought of a damn white
Yeah,
bear.
and you have that whole thing where there's affirmations and there's all these different things in self-help. And what I liked about the book here is you kind of take it from a neuroscience perspective, which was really freeing for me personally when I began to see, oh, okay, well, this is just chemicals and these things are happening. Can you get into that a little bit, the difference, in understanding? Because this is, your tools are not just another like self-help things. If I do these or I say these things, then, I'm good to go.
So like the difference between like the self-help industry and what I'm trying to do with this book.
Yes,
that is,
yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think the self-help industry, it's an interesting one. There are some ideas that are promoted there that are science-based and that are useful. Then there are other ideas that don't have any scientific basis, but there's a strong placebo effect attached to them, which is you've got someone out there who's promoting an idea and who has some credibility and charisma. And people really believe that doing this thing is going to help them just because they believe in this person. And as I talk about in Chatter, beliefs and expectations are powerful. And there's benefit that you can derive from just believing that something good will come, of doing something that is totally benign, like taking a sugar pill. Then there are things that I think are promoted, ideas are promoted that are bad for people. What I tried to do in Chatter is comb through the scientific literature and really only talk about things that are based in science. I also tried to blow up some myths that exist, myths that surround that relate to how people think they should deal with Chatter because they think it's beneficial, but they actually backfire. And I study a topic called self-regulation. Fancy, kind of a fancy technical term, but if you wanted to translate that term, it's in a certain sense the science of how people can help themselves. There is a science about this, a science that looks at the brain, that looks at genes, and does rigorous studies to vet ideas. And I think we would all be better off as a society if we were turning to science for advice rather than people's intuitions. Sometimes our intuitions are great, and I'm an intuitive person, and we heard about intuitions before, but sometimes those intuitions can lead us astray, and science can help us distinguish between those two states. Science isn't perfect. It's always growing, it's always evolving, but I think it gives us the best chance at any given moment for finding the best solution to the problems we face.
Yeah, and Alex, if you would speak to this, because I think this is great. Somebody having a belief system and just believing in that. I mean, we've seen a lot of, and you talk about this in chapter 2.
Yeah.
When talking to ourself backfires, but we've seen a lot of carnage done in humanity with a belief system.
Yeah, belief is, in my mind, it's also another one of those tools, right?
Totally.
I personally don't like the idea of belief, and I'll share with you why. Belief says that I don't have all the facts in an objective sense. So I have to afford my attention to a third party to tell me what my reality should be. And then from that, all my decisions and actions lie within the frame of reference from what some other third party defines for me as the truth. And that can be a very powerful thing. And it also drives away self-responsibility for my actions. And when I look at what you're saying here in terms of having that internal dialogue, that requires responsibility. But then when you started to bring it over to that pairing of belief, it's like, well, I feel like that's almost like the counter to what you're actually offering, individuals as a tool or solution to their own mental chatter that's going on. Do you see what I'm kind of getting at here?
Well, I do. I would say that the way that I think about this is, we do in many cases want people to maintain a sense of responsibility. Sometimes,
Right.
Interestingly enough, we could feel too responsible, and it's useful to back off a little bit.
Yeah.
But in general, we don't want to excuse people for engaging in potentially bad behaviors and things of that sort. But I think of other people as another source of information. So there's information for how we should think, feel, or behave in any given situation that comes from within us, from those internal conversations we have with ourselves, which are based on lots of experiences that we've had in the world and information that is privy only to us. But other people can sometimes be, especially if you speak to the right people, credible people who have good intentions and are knowledgeable of a particular issue that you're dealing with, they can offer different perspectives. And when we hear their perspectives, we don't have to follow their advice, but it gives us information we can use before making our ultimate judgment. So whenever I'm dealing with a major decision, whether it be about business or personal life, I'll introspect. I'll go inside for answers. But if it's a really weighty issue, I'll often also consult my personal board of advisors. So I've got one, and we don't necessarily meet, each quarter to go over the state of Ethan's mind, but they're on retainer, like
be on
they're
the damn
buddies.
board.
You want to be on the board? We'll
I'm
get
on
you
the
a
board.
seat. Yeah, we have great dinners. So I'll consult with them. I'll get their take. I don't always follow their advice, but I like hearing it. I like seeing how other people are thinking about something before I make a judgment. So I think that's one way that other people's ideas can impact us. With respect to the question of people who are peddling things and trying to get you to just do stuff because they say it's good for you when in fact it isn't. I think knowing that is possible, and for listeners, just to be clear what we're talking about instances of people peddling treatments like that they say will change your life, will make you happy, relieve your depression, your anxiety, make you a better person. And these treatments actually have no medicinal value at all. They're effectively sugar pills or placebos. Yet research shows that if you believe that engaging in certain behaviors, like taking a pill that someone tells you is going to make you feel good, if you think it will have that effect, it often does. Knowing that there is that back door into how the human mind works in a certain sense, that you could convince people of things like that. I think we want to know about that so we could be resistant to those kinds of influences at the appropriate times. But I also think that information can be useful because we can try to use it to our benefit, to achieve good goals. And so let me go back to my kids as an example. When my kids, young kids like to make a big deal out of boo-boos. I mean, they scrape their knee and it's like the Eiffel Tower is crumbling upon them.
Jason does it all the time. It's brutal.
Yeah, there you go. So Jason is nodding affirmatively. I like you even more, Jason. Come hang out at our house. So, I'll do things like, here's a Band-Aid. Put this on. It's going to make you feel better. It's going to take the pain away. Now, that's me channeling this power of expectancy to bring out some good, to help them feel better. I'm not actually lying to them. I'm actually going straight from the science, right? In fact, if they think that putting this Band-Aid on is going to make them feel better, it will make them feel better. That's what the science says. So that's a way of trying to harness the power of belief towards some good. I think physicians do this all the time, some really talented physicians, right? They don't just give you a diagnosis and say, pick up the script. They put their hand on your shoulder and they say, it's going to be okay. You're going to get better, and so forth.
Is it belief in that moment when you're talking to your child? Because is it the will of the power of the mind really over the pain? And that's a very objective thing that is occurring. So say I do create some pain. I do hurt myself. And putting the Band-Aid over it is a reinforcement of the idea of my willpower over that pain receptor as it's being, coming through my nervous system and then being processed in my brain, right? As synapses are firing, I'm actually building up the will to deal with that sort of emotional control over that pain. So I don't think that is belief. I think that's a function of focus, attention, and control over what is actually occurring in the body at a biological level. Wouldn't you say?
Well, if you look at the pathways that are being activated by these placebo responses, and I should say they're complicated, and
Yeah.
there's no single neural pathway that characterizes every placebo effect, because there are placebo effects for mood, and there are placebo effects for stomach pain and headaches, and not surprisingly, different things are happening in the brain for each of those different states. But effectively, if we wanted to do a cartoon version of what's happening in the brain, um, when you hear a message from someone else that you believe, that's activating your prefrontal cortex, part of the front part of your brain, a network in your prefrontal cortex that's involved in managing your expectations, your what you think is going to happen next. The brain is a one giant prediction machine. It's constantly trying to predict what is going to happen next. And the reason for that is that's what lets us like be productive in this world. Like, it's predicting at the most basic level. If you've got to walk from point A to point B, before you take a step, your brain is making predictions about how far you have to leap to get to the next point, right? So it's always thinking ahead. And this is true of how your body feels and reacts as well. And so the placebo is, I'm changing your expectation for
Mm.
what's going to happen next in your mind or in your body. And once you have that expectation, that in turn, that pattern of brain activity connects to other parts of your brain that are involved in generating those emotional responses or physical pain responses. So it's all connected. And what's if I'm going to geek out with you guys for a second, the glory of the placebo effect is it speaks on the one hand to the potential of our minds to heal ourselves. It's
Right.
remarkable. Like, we can, by thinking differently about something, change our physical and emotional pain response. But we don't have full access to that ability. We often have to have someone else turn on that that self-control machinery, if you will, that emotion regulation machinery. We can't do it ourselves. And so there's a lot more we have to learn about how to master our mind, is what that speaks to me.
Are you telling me then that my mind, my conscious thoughts, are living in expectations? So they are actually residing in the future, while my body, biologically, with its bioinformatics, are living in the moment. And I am actually moving my body into the future of where my thought would be. I
Yes,
think that's what you explained.
that's a nice way of describing it.
So that would then tell me that my body lives in space time, this sense of physical, and the mind lives in time space, affording it to think about the past, present, and future all at once. And that I'm actually moving myself, my world, my physical world, is willed to its next spot because of my immaterial thoughts that drive the biological functions of my body to get me where I need to be going. So things fire up in the expectation of an immaterial world to create a very material outcome. So would that mean that our driver for everything we do in this world is actually a function of thought that leads to material change, rather than the material actually leading to the thought?
Um, well, materialism can lead us down a different path, but I might use a slightly different set of terms to describe it. I think what you're describing is the brain as a mental time traveler, and
Yes.
as essentially a giant machine that is constantly performing calculations. Some of these calculations are based on experiences that we've had in the past. Other calculations are based on forecasts that we're making about the future. And all that information is being integrated constantly to provide you with the best chance of being successful. Biologically being successful, what does that mean? It means getting from point A to point B sometimes and just
Mm-hmm.
walking or running. Psychologically successful, that might mean like feeling good, having good well-being. So the idea is it's constantly making these predictions, and the ability to do so depends heavily on the ability of our minds to travel in time. And so, to bring it back to the self self-hindustry. That's not what I wanted to say.
That's actually a very interesting new thing
Yeah.
you've created.
That's right. That's right. That's a new industry. To bring it back to the self-help industry in full circle, um, you know, the idea there can be real value of living in the moment, and it's a tool. But I think it's often the way that idea has been conveyed and translated for the masses. Um, there have been some problems associated with the translation because our minds weren't built to always be in the moment.
Mhm.
And in fact, we wouldn't want to have our minds always in the moment. What distinguishes us from other species is our ability to travel in time in our minds, to learn from the past, make sense of the future, integrate that information, to figure out who we are and be better people. And um, so that's that's one little peeve I have about that messaging about
Yeah.
being in the moment. It can strategically be very useful to be in the moment at times.
But
It's
not all
great
the
for me
time.
to, but not all the time. And also it's not, I don't think it's possible, just given how the mind works.
I want to go into chapter 5 because I think this leads right into it, the power and peril of other people. And I want to use kind of something fun. We were talking about this before the show started because we could get into some political stuff and that's kind of silly. Don't want to do that. But there's this new phenomenon about UFOs. And I'm not going to get into
Yeah, this
UFOs.
is
I'm just using
interesting.
this as an example. And everybody has this bias towards it. They're wanting to believe it. And so now you're having, especially younger people, millennials and younger. So now the governments are coming out saying, there's this or that. What is the power when it comes to us having this belief collectively in something?
Well, having these collective beliefs, essentially, I think that in my language, that often takes the form of having these norms, or the ways of thinking about the world that our culture endorses. And norms can be very powerful for shaping the way people live their lives, right? Like, I mean, there are norms where I live right now that when someone cuts you off when you're driving the car, you don't honk your horn. Very, very different from like where I grew up in New York when someone cut you off. Like it was a, Martin Scorsese movie every time that happened, right? So like, and there are consequences associated with Martin Scorsese behavior. So that's a norm, a collective belief about how we should think, feel, or behave. And norms are really powerful. I think of a norm as so if you want to change people's behaviors, you could do it from what we might call the inside out, right? So I'm making commitment to change the way I think, feel, or behave myself. I'm using tools to bring those changes to fruition and I get change. But then there are outside in sources of change. And that's where norms, collective beliefs come into play. There are, and norms exist at different levels. There are norms at the level of geography and where we live, which is what I described before with the, cutting people off. But there are organizational norms. There are family norms. Like we do things within my family at the dinner table, and I'm not going to tell you what those are, that other families don't do at the dinner table, and vice versa. So norms and collective beliefs are powerful, but they are malleable, I should say, as well. They can really
Yeah.
shift.
And when, because there's so much information being thrown at us, and a lot of the information, is biased, especially when we look at social media. And you have a tool, or you talked about this in the book, being a fly on the wall. And I think this is really, really important, especially for people that are consuming so much of this online information, how you process that and how you can look at that information. And we're really big on this at Tartle, especially with data.
Yeah.
When it comes to making sure that, you have the ability to be able to inside of yourself to process and find, what is truth, and take the time to do that instead of having a bias, especially here in the United States on the far left or far right, or, being centric or whatever. When you look at that, when you talked about being on the fly on the wall, can you kind of explain that so everyone understands that?
Yeah. So when we experience chatter in particular, when we get stuck in these negative thought loops, we tend to zoom in on our problems, which makes a great deal of sense, right? There's a problem, and so let's focus on it really carefully. Tunnel vision. The problem is that we often get stuck in that very narrow focus, which makes it hard for us to consider the bigger picture and alternative ways of thinking about the problem that might actually provide us with some really good solutions. And so the fly on the wall, which is shorthand for many different distancing techniques, involves being able to psychologically take a step back from the situation, to pull back, to see that bigger picture. Now, you could do that in lots of different ways. You could do it with imagery, and some of our early studies focused on imagery. You'd have people think about painful experiences, and then rather than replay them happening through their own eyes, have people see themselves in that scene and see everything else. Look at, kind of like you see in these video games or documentaries, there's like a first person image of what you're looking at, and then the camera zooms out all the way to like space to see the bigger picture. That puts our problems in perspective, usually in ways that can be pretty powerful, right? Like, it's one thing to contemplate. We'll stick with the driving example because I used it before. Getting flipped off by someone else can be really annoying, but you zoom out and you realize that, it's a little speck during the day amidst war and famine and pandemics elsewhere. That really puts your problems in perspective in ways that can minimize them. So, you could do it with imagery, you could do it with language, talking to yourself in the third person silently. All right, Ethan, how are you going to manage this? There, you're talking to yourself like you're another person. And that's giving you some psychological space. We know it's much, much easier for people to give advice to other people than it is to follow their own advice. That's what we call, yeah.
If I am talking to myself in the third person, am I speaking to my psyche from my consciousness? So the ego of how I identify myself and my personality. What I'm doing is I'm splitting the context of perspective from the first person and the macro. So I pull a macro micro at the same time. Is that what this third person?
Yeah, it's an interesting hybrid case, right? So there's thinking about yourself in the first person, I, me, my.
Yeah.
And then there's thinking about other people altogether, Alex, and the idea is that this is like an intermediary point, right? So it's much easier for me to give you advice on your problems than it is for me to weigh in on my own from the first person. When we use our name and the second person pronoun you to refer to ourselves, essentially, we're thinking about ourselves like we were someone else. Makes it much easier to be objective. With a caveat, we're thinking about ourselves as another person whose inner thoughts and feelings we have privileged access to. Because I can think all I want about what Alex is thinking and feeling right now. I can't really know. You got a pretty good poker face.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But I know exactly what Ethan is feeling right now because I have access to that internal information. So it's this intermediary point. It's almost maximizing the benefits, right? You're getting the information that you uniquely bring to the situation about who you are and how you feel, but you can weigh in on your problem with a bit more objectivity, just like a friend of yours would be able to give you advice. But ideally, you give the friend who's advising you all the information they need to make the best recommendation. We don't always do that, right? But you have access to all that information yourself.
Well, and some people are actually ashamed of certain aspects within their mind.
Absolutely.
So they actually don't afford themselves full attention as a third party to themselves in their own ego sense to have that conversation to its maximum. Which
Absolutely.
That would essentially hinder the conscious evolution of that individual in dealing with negative catalysts and not looking at it as a sense of this negative catalyst defines who they are, but really to look at it as that learning experience for them to use for their own evolution, right? It's an error. It's not a sin. It's not anything bad. And I don't really look at things as bad like you talk about. It's really about finding that integration point and using that catalyst of the other side to make it into something positive. And I think when we look at that from a learning environment and we're not ashamed of the experience we have had in life, affords us the opportunity to learn and grow and understand ourselves better. And once we do that, we can understand others.
And Eve, I would take it a step further, and sometimes it might be a sin or something bad, but that doesn't mean that um, you're beyond hope, that you can't move on with your lives, right? So interesting story. I remember to this point, and I think it's an important point that speaks to the value of these distancing tools, of being able to weigh in on your own problems from a distance. I had a friend who was seeing a therapist for something that they were struggling with, and I knew what the deal was, but they were really ashamed of this problem, and it was giving rise to all sorts of additional issues, anxiety and depression and things like that. And I remember asking the person, "So did you talk to them about that thing?" Like, "Oh no, I wouldn't tell them about that."
See?
Because there are some places that people are reluctant to go, but if you already know where you've been there, so you have access to that information. So I think that's another reason why these tools can be so helpful.
You define it as tool, and I may be way off base here with this.
I'll tell you if you are.
Your father, beard, cigarette, meditation, Bhagavad Gita. I feel like you have taken a scientific approach and explanation without using words like meditation and other things of the fact to describe what your father actually did. And I think that sounds like quite a dramatic influence on your life. You've just brought it down more of a scientific path rather than the social science path that your father would have taken with his own meditative process of introspection. Am I wrong with that?
Well, I think there's definitely a continuum there, in the sense that some of the issues that my dad talked to me about were foundational for shaping the way I think about myself and the world. And the tack that I've taken has been to use science to explore some of those ideas
Love that.
and take them further. And in exploring some of those ideas, we've learned that some of them aren't always exactly as they're portrayed. There's a whole lot more to controlling ourselves than meditating. And and another one way to think about this is kind of like if you think about alternative medicine and conventional medicine. So there's a lot of like wonderful benefits that we get from certain plants and I think you talked about shrubs before.
Yeah, I did.
Shrubs. A lot of medicines come from those places. What science has done really well is to identify what the active ingredients are within those plants and shrubs and flowers or whatever. Like what are the molecules that drive these medicinal benefits? And then once we know what those ingredients are, we can create pills and interventions to strategically target them to give people the best shot of getting better. In a certain sense, that's the way I think about what I do. I'm dealing with this issue of how people can control their mind when it's getting the best of them, when they're experiencing chatter. And we're trying to do these mechanism studies, mechanical studies to understand, all right, well, what are the levers you can pull that really help people? Practices like meditation pull lots of different levers, and we've been trying to reverse engineer how that works and lots of other things too. But there's certainly a strong connection with my dad and upbringing, and it is, as a father now myself, it's an important reminder to me about the role that I play in potentially shaping where my kids are going to go with their own life. In fact, my oldest daughter, she's like, I want to be a psychologist, neuroscientist when I grow up. I'm like, are you sure?
Yeah.
Like that could be great, but we should probably explore lots of different things, and so we really caretakers are really in a really privileged position for determining what happens next or
Well, that's
influencing.
interesting. Because when you think about caretaking, there is programming that we receive from our parents and our teachers and people outside of us. And you talk much to the fact that there are loops that we fall into within our own mind. And if I'm following this train of thought, the mind acts in its timeless sense. It's a time machine. It sits in timelessness. Falling into a loop is something that makes sense. It's this line that comes back to itself, which it can do because it's timeless. And so when I fall into a thing of programming, it's almost like the thought carries a sense of gravity with it. So it's easy to fall into that well of thought. And it's not so much negative. It's just that the programming is so strong for falling into those cycles that to get out of that gravity requires quite a significant amount of willpower, whether it be a negative cycle or a positive one. Do you find that the programming that happens in our mind from our parents, from our teachers, from our gurus, whoever it might be, that we have the will within our own introspection and thought to go and retest that theory of gravity in our mind and put ourselves into new cycles, new loops that are more positive and self-fulfilling for our evolutive benefit?
Well, I think what you're describing is the process of growth and change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we absolutely have that capacity. There are certain tools that make it easier, but there's also the need for motivation and drive. So if we step back a little bit and we just think about like what does it mean to be able to control yourself? And I think about self-control as the ability to align our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors with our goals. Like, so, you have ways you want to think, feel, behave. How do you do that? There are two elements that go into this ability to control ourselves. There's motivation, and then there's ability or tools. And you need both of those elements. You can have access to all of the tools that exist. You could read my book, read the appendix, all the 26 different tools. If you're not motivated to use those tools, they're just going to sit in the cobweb toolbox of your mind, right? They're not going to get any action. So you've got to be motivated to use them and have access. The flip side is a lot of people are highly motivated to feel better, to not get stuck in chatter, but they don't actually know what the tools are because
Right.
no one has taught them what those tools are.
Boom.
Or they've been taught the wrong tools.
Yes.
And so you need both elements.
Gosh, and having those elements, do you have a filtering mechanism you use to say, this is a tool that is truly evolutive towards this focus or goal that I have or would like to achieve? How do you filter in terms of that access when you do receive it to a new tool? Is this the right one to use?
So this is where the process of self-experimentation begins. And it's where science stops for the moment.
Mm-hmm.
There I hope will be a coming soon to a theater, bookstore, newspaper near you.
Love
so
that.
What science has done a really good job of doing is identifying individual tools. What we haven't yet done, we're doing it now, we're working on it, is we haven't figured out what are the unique combinations of tools that work best for different people in different situations, right? When I deal with rejection at work, there's one set of tools that works really, really well for me. I use distant self-talk, talk to myself silently with my name. I'll do temporal distancing. I'll go to my chatter advisory board, talk to a couple of people whose opinion I value, and maybe I'll take a walk in a green space if I can, if the Michigan weather permits. But if I get into an argument with my wife, there are a different set of tools that I'll rely on, right? And that's a profile that really works for me. There's some overlapping tools, but there are also some different ones there. And so I think we all can. I think the best that I can do as a scientist who's steeped in this world is I can give people the tools. And then I can ask people to start the process of self-experimenting, of, try out these different tools. Try one. If it serves you well, keep using it. If it doesn't serve you well, don't use it. Try something else. Maybe try the tool that didn't work here and try it there. There's going to be a lot of variability because we're all so unique. So, so I think what we all should be doing is thinking about, well, what are the instances in which we need tools? And then once we find ourselves in those instances, use them. I'll just say really quickly, I often get asked, do I ever experience chatter? Like I just wrote a book on chatter and how to manage it. Hey, Dr. Kross, you ever experience chatter?
No, I'm immune.
That's right. Of course I experience chatter. I'm a human, and I think I'll always have it perk up at times. What I've gotten really good at is being able to quickly detect once it starts to brew. I know what it is. I know where to look. I could put a label on it. I know it's coming sometimes, or I know when I'm in it. And the moment that happens, I go to my toolbox. All right, Ethan, you've been here before. It's going to fade. I'm there. It's a little distant self-talk and mental time travel. Like, you'll feel better about this in a week. I've got my bat phone ready to go to call my buddies if I need some additional support.
Right.
And I've got the world around me to do a few different things. So I've got a very specific plan of what to do when I experience chatter. And that helps because I'm usually pretty good at nipping it in the bud the moment it activates. And there's real value that I derive from possessing that capacity. And it's something that I think listeners would benefit from as well.
I love that. And Ethan, I want to make sure we're respectful of your time. On the book here, and we both have a copy, Chatter. One thing I want to commend you on, and is awesome, and both of us were talking about this, is the notes section. That was so awesome. I mean, I've never seen that extensive of notes. I think you went from like page 170 or 160 something all the way to 200 and something. So what like last question, what drove you to put the notes in there like that?
Second to last question.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny you say that notes section was actually scaled back a lot.
Wow.
So, I'm a scientist by my day job. So, everything that I put in there is backed up by an article or 100 articles. And so, so I like to be really comprehensive in making sure that I'm covering my bases. And this was not a shoot from the hip, here's what I think book. This was, here's the science and here's how I'm integrating it for you and showing you why it matters and how it plays out in the world. But the sources were really important to me to show that this is grounded in rigor.
I want to just talk about one last thing before you go, and I'm going to abuse this time with you. The dream state. I came to a realization some time ago that about 35 to 45% of my life, I have my eyes closed and I'm dreaming. And it's a huge amount of data that is occurring. And I thought, there's a lot of things, emotions that trigger in my dream state that actually ended up getting carried into my waking day. So I afforded myself the opportunity of recording these dreams every single day. And it's a practice I took up. And what I found is that I start to have a conversation with my dream state because I figured it was about 40% of the data of my life that most people typically ignore. And I was wondering, is it in the dream state chatter, or is it absolute, pure, logical, deep-seated, emotional information that the subconscious is bringing up into the conscious state for us to use as another part of our toolbox?
So you say this is the question you save for the end, huh?
Yeah, I don't. If it goes over, if you want to go over, please. But I'm
just joking for you. Well, look, there's a whole lot of mystery that still surrounds the sleep and dream state, and I really dove into this literature for the book. I talk a very little bit about dreaming. So there's still more that we don't know about dreaming than I think we do. One of the things we have some evidence for is that there's certainly some chatter that brews in our dream states. There's a really interesting creative theory called the threat simulation hypothesis, and it's the idea that one of the things we do in our dreams, not the only thing, is we are simulating threats that could happen in the world. And like the mind, the brain during sleep and dreaming is kind of like a virtual reality simulator. It's allowing us to practice how we're going to respond in case we ever experience those kinds of events. And, ergo why you've probably experienced the showing up naked at school dream at some point or another. Like,
here's what I find interesting, and psychoanalyze me for a second. If I'm in a threatening state or something that is pushing me through some sort of emotional turmoil in the dream state, I'm typically in a safe place, but there's a very heavy catalyst that is occurring in a place that I have great emotional connection to and great joy that has come from. So it's almost like, I'm just through my experience, that my mind in the dream state puts me somewhere safe so that when it brings up a difficult catalyst for me to focus on, it does it in a good learning environment where I feel like I can actually deal with it.
Well, that's the idea in part behind this threat simulation hypothesis. There's a reference to it in the book. You might enjoy reading about this. It's a really creative, clever theory. That's not the only thing that happens when we dream. There's a lot of randomness that happens there. So I would not use the words logic and to describe what's happening all the time when we're dreaming. There's a lot of random firing that we're still trying to figure out. Does it have any meaning, or is it just synapses firing and like clearing the mental workspace and, consolidating memories, deciding which ones to transition into long-term storage versus, to let go of altogether. So there are a lot. Dreaming is an incredibly complicated process that likely serves many, many different functions.
So then I guess what you mean is that the brain in the physical sense and how it's firing would define the tract of the dream state narrative.
To some extent, it does.
And then, but in our waking life, us living in the timeless sense of thought has to happen and occur before there's a material effect of a synapse actually firing. That seems like a paradox to me. I know I'm brutal to deal with.
I don't think it's paradoxical, but we'd have to go deeper into it.
Well,
to figure it out.
I'd love to go deeper sometime if you want to.
Yeah, I'd be totally happy to do it at some other time. We could have a deep session, chatter in the brain.
Well, I love that. We'll do a late night Tartlecast with Ethan Kross, the deep night chatter session. That fires.
That would get a lot of listeners.
Yeah, I think that'd be amazing. Well, listen, we'll close this up. Ethan, thank you for writing this. Thank you for the immense amounts of temperance of your own mind that if you have shared in this wonderful toolbox, starting at page 161. Everybody, make sure you read the book first before you just jump to the back. Otherwise, you won't have any context. Thank you for doing this. You are taking us beyond the typical Freudian view of the world, and I sincerely appreciate that. I think we needed the change. This book's a breath of fresh air for understanding our own thoughts. And you are a champion of mind data. So thank you very much.
Do you have a website or social media that everyone can go to?
Yeah, they can go. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. This was a really fun and stimulating conversation. So thank you. You can go to www.ethankross.com. It's Kross with a K, Kross. That'll have info about the book, my lab, research, me, and all the social media channels are up there too: Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn.
Amazing. Well, Ethan, thank you again for jumping on here. We will get that deep night session together, and I know you're going to
over duck in Albuquerque.
Over duck in Albuquerque.
There we go.
Get you a T-shirt that says that.